Once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Now for the second part of our lecture, we are going to talk about theories of justice. Why is it important to talk about theories of justice when we are discussing sustainability? Is that, as we have seen at the very end, there's no conclusive thought about what's the best approach for sustainability, because it depends on how we understand the level of substitutability between different forms of capital. But it's just a technical way of talking about things which they have an ethical framework. So let's try in the second part of this discussion to talk about the theories of justice. This will correspond to our set 2, our PowerPoint 2, and I have suggested some references such as the book Justice, chapters 1-3, from Sandel's book Justice, and some chapters from Sen and Nussbaum as well. But well, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk in person, and I can complement this reading list if you wish. But let's start with our first question here. What's the idea of policymaking? What's the main objective of policymaking when we are discussing development, and when we are talking about not simply governments but civil societies, NGOs and others moving forward with development? What's that? What's the main purpose? And in the whole literature, it seems that there are at least 3 answers that they come quite often. Some people say that the main objective of policymaking is to make us happy, is about subjective well-being, about people being satisfied with certain aspects of things that are going on with their lives. But others would suggest that happiness, that this mental state of happiness is not the main thing, that it's about rights, that's about freedom, it's about respecting elements that would define people's dignity. And that's a different approach. And then we have a third approach, which is the most difficult, I guess, because it's very subtle. It's about things that would make us human, and that relates to Aristotelian ethics and virtue as characteristics of things that human beings are able to do with excellence. Now, when we translate this set of issues to the main thing we are talking about, which is about sustainability, we might introduce several questions which are of fundamental importance, questions about the constitutions of law and how governments and institutions should interfere with people's behavior, which at the very end is about how societies should be organized. We are talking about the different ways in which societies are organized, and ultimately how people should treat each other. But of course, you know that some aspects are public and other aspects are private, and we are talking about the links between private and public aspects in this discussion. Now, and one of the main difficulties with that is, how can we define morality? How can we define ethics? And I like very much Sandel's examples and discussions, because they are things that when we see them from a purely economic perspective, we would say, well, it's natural. We should not control prices, for instance. Then we have a big environmental disaster. People are without water, and we have people selling water at a price that is 10, 20 plus times that should cost. Is this something moral? Is this something that should be done? Is this something that government should intervene or not? Or for instance, as we have seen in the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, with banks indulging into different forms of speculation, and governments going there and bailing out with public money. Should we do that? Should markets work and assume their consequences? Or is there something such as the common good and the consequences of all these wrong speculative acts should be responsibility of only the banks, of everyone? So these are tricky issues. They're very, very good examples, because at the very end we might see some inconsistencies in the way that some responsibilities are considered individual responsibilities and other responsibilities are taken as social responsibilities. So these issues of morality, quite often when we are talking about sustainability as overall, they involve coordination problems. And these coordination problems are about how people treat each other, how we consider our links with other people. So several of these issues, and climate change, as we're going to see later, is just quintessential issue on that. Now, but how can we understand? What are the analytical tools we have in order to understand all these different views and these different opinions that people have about what should be done? Now, corresponding to these three different ways in which we could answer that question of what's the purpose of policy making, we have three main approaches to justice. We have, bread and butter utilitarianism. We have a perspective based on freedom, and we can talk about primary goods and even about capabilities on that, Amartya Sen's capabilities. And then we have Aristotle, which is much more subtle, but that it's about the role of common good, virtue and the common good. So let's emphasize this discussion on utilitarianism versus freedom and say some few words about the Aristotelian practice. Now, when we are doing a microeconomic exercise, what's the main objective of an allocation of any kind of resource? Is that we want to maximize utility. You have seen that before. We want to maximize utility. So you have two people, yeah? For this first people, you have a glass of water, yeah? You give to this person the glass of water, and the utility of this person will increase in 10. You give this glass of water to another person, and then the utility would increase in 5. To whom would you give this glass of water? Of course, if you want to maximize overall utility, you will give to that person whose utility will increase in 10. Then let's go to the next glass of water. And then you will give the next glass of water to that person whose utility will increase in 5. This person is still there. Or will you give to the other person? Now, you gave water to the person whose utility will increase in 10. This means that the second glass of water will not increase utility by the same level, because you know that marginal utility is decreasing. As you have more and more of whatever, what you add in terms of utility decreases. So let's consider that this has decreased from 10 to 8. Now, tell me, would you give the glass of water to that person that utility will increase in 8, or would increase to the other person who would increase in 5? Of course, you would carry on giving to that person whose utility has increased in 8 till they have the same 5 utility. Then you are indifferent. Yeah. Now the graph you can see for marginal utility of A and marginal utility of B is explained by this very simple exercise. Yeah. Now, what happens is that by doing so, overall utility is maximized. And utilitarianism has considered that's a fair way of proceeding, that allocating resources in this way. Now, this graph appears in one of Amartya Sen's books, and what Sen argues is that we don't know anything about B or A. And we could be allocating a resource that is, let's consider, important for their mobility. But it might well be that A is a poorer converter of resources into mobility because A has a disability. So we would end up giving lower amount of resources to that particular person that would have a disability and that would need to achieve the same level of mobility. We need actually more resources. We would have to do more things in a city to allow that person to achieve a higher level of mobility. So sometimes what is the utilitarian result might not be fair, but that depends on which space are we assessing fairness here. That's a very important challenge. Now I have put to you in the next slide a quotation that comes from Sandel's book. I'm not going to read that quotation. Normally I would read that quotation in class, but here I'm not going to read, so I leave to you, that is in your PowerPoint, that quotation about St. Anne's College in Oxford, to show some of the contradictions that might come within utilitarianism. And then mention to you that normally, in a very simplified, in a stylized way, we would say that there are two main versions of utilitarianism. We have the version by Jeremy Bentham, that pleasure and pain calculation. Now, in fact, Bentham was a much more sophisticated thinker than that. He was not even concerned with economics and with cost-benefit analysis. His problem was a different problem. He was concerned with jurisprudence, with the fact that different places in England, they had different laws and different common laws, and then he was thinking about a way of rationalizing that. But economists have used that principle, and especially Stanley Jevons has used that principle and have included that into a way of thinking about pleasure and pain and economics. Of course, we know that people decide on whatever they do, even on their shopping, based on a wide range of psychological phenomena and different motives. But when we talk about Bentham, we talk about a calculation. In a simplified way, we talk about pleasure and pain. So there are three main features of utilitarianism, and one of these features is that it always involves an assessment of consequences, and we have consequences, the positive aspects and the negative aspects of consequences, and that would fit well into cost-benefit analysis. Of course, what John Stuart Mill did was something which complicated a little bit Bentham's calculation, because they are not fully translatable, commensurable. What is interesting in a cost-benefit analysis is that they are fully commensurable. So you can have a little bit more here, a little bit less that, and we have a simple trade-off between them. But what John Stuart Mill said, and it's our next PowerPoint, is that we have higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And Sandel suggests that a competition between Shakespeare and The Simpsons could illustrate that Shakespeare would talk about much higher things in life, and The Simpsons would talk about, more trivial things perhaps, or lower critiques than that. Now, not necessarily. It is always tricky to do that, but that's the illustration it provides. What matters is that when we talk about utilitarianism, we talk about three things. We talk about a perspective that gives full emphasis to consequences. And the second, the consequences of influences, or these consequences, or all in terms of utility. And then we have a calculation, we have a sum ranking. So we get consequences in terms of utility, and we have an overall calculation. Now you can imagine that by doing so, if one person earns 10 and another person earns 1, someone is entering into this calculation 10 times more than another person. So there's a certain distributional indifference. One can think about GDP, how GDP sometimes represents more the income of those people who are in a comfortable position, or wealthier people, richer people, in comparison to the poor. If someone has not even a job, if someone does not receive anything, GDP doesn't mean much for this person. But you can also think that if someone is a woman, and normally women would receive in labor markets because of gender discrimination, 20%, let's say, less than men. So the way they benefit from an increase on GDP per capita is not the same as well. So utilitarianism has several limitations, and one of the limitations is this distributional indifference, because we are aggregating everything and we are giving the same level of importance to the level of utilities. The second thing is that because everything would matter in terms of consequences and utilities, there are certain aspects of life that they only matter for the utility they are able to generate. So let's consider, for instance, the violation of a right of a child for their childhood. So one would say, a utilitarian would say, okay, if we put children to work in a poor country producing sports goods, well, yeah, there's a reduction in utility for children losing their childhood. They could be playing, they could be at school, but they are working. But, well, at the same time, there's some money involved, so it depends on the calculation. Of course, the main issue here that some people would say is that we are violating their rights, or the rights that they have for their childhood. And by doing so, utilitarianism does not give the same importance that they should. There are things in life that we don't do, not because they will not generate enough profit for us, but because they shouldn't be done. They are wrong things. So all information which is non-utility information, which are not generating utility, is not something that utilitarianism would consider or would not give proper consideration. But there is a last thing that we should talk about, and then you might see the next PowerPoint. You might see a fox and some grapes, yeah. And you might think initially that these grapes are really delicious, they're really good, yeah, and the fox wants these grapes. But that comes an old story. I think one of the latest versions might be by La Fontaine, or Fox and the Sour Grapes, that because the fox could not get the grapes, you can see how difficult to get the grapes here, the fox would have said, well, I did not want the grapes anyway. And what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that not simply the fox, but everyone in life might not trust even one's judgment if we are in a condition in which deprivation, the impossibility of achieving something, might cause us to change our objective views or about a reality, about a certain reality. So the difficulty here is straightforward, is that utility might neglect distribution, might not give due importance to rights and other non-utility information, and might not be a reliable information every time that this is subject to what we call adaptive preferences. The problem of adaptive preferences was first defined by a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin in these two essays of liberty. And what he was trying to say is that sometimes we try to defend ourselves psychologically. Think about a woman that is hit by, I don't know, a husband. But it's difficult because she loves at the same time her husband. So she tries to excuse her husband, say, well, he did that because, well, it was a very tense day today. or all men do that, or any kinds of excuses. It's very common to find that kind of narrative in developing countries, but also in developed countries. Let's not excuse. So sometimes people are in a difficult situation, and you yourselves, you might have been in a situation before. Go back to your high school days where you liked someone in class, but that person did not pay attention to you, and you could say, oh, but she or he was not that pretty, you could say. That would be the same thing, would be the same reasoning. This means that is utilitarianism rubbish? No, we are not saying that. But what we are saying is that utilitarianism, which is the foundation of economic reasoning, or at least of much of economic reasoning, is actually behind weak versions of sustainability. It makes natural capital just another form of capital, so they are fully commensurable, they are fully substitutable. So this welfarism, which is an important feature of utilitarianism, you assess consequence in terms of utility, and all utilities are comparable. They are all under the same metric. This is something which provides a real limitation in real life for utilitarianism. So at the same time, it provides a real limitation for weak versions of sustainability. Why? Because different forms of capital, they are not fully substitutable. Because sometimes people prefer not to benefit, not to profit from certain situations, but they prefer to do the right thing. Now, what will be the right thing? So what's the freedom perspective? So much to say about that. So we should talk about Kant, and we should talk about all imperatives that Kant had, but let's make our lives easier. Let's go to or the person who was the most distinguished philosopher in the last century, who put together in his first book back in 1971, A Theory of Justice, who has put this freedom perspective in its contemporary format. So you are seeing now the picture of John Rawls. So I have included some of the books for people who are scholars in John Rawls. They know how John Rawls has changed some aspects of his theory. But here we don't have to enter into these details. It is important for us to understand what his theory is about. And let me put in very simple terms for you. We could start with a simple question. So let's imagine that Rawls was thinking, well, is there such a thing as a just society in the world? What do you think? Do we live in just societies in the world? Now, Rawls said no, we don't. But, and that's the interesting thing in his question, if we were to live in a just society, what are the main conditions that that society would have to fulfill in order to be considered just? So he started from a perspective that was initially defined in political science by Hobbes. So thinking of a society as a social contract. And the social contract was something which would include people from all kinds of life in society, and then together they would define the main laws or constitution of societies. Now, in order to be in a position, people would have to be considered that they have the same conditions to engage. So they would be equal and they would be free. And these are words used by Rawls. But what happens when people are equal and free? They do not know the place they are in society. So when they are discussing any kind of policy, they are not thinking, well, I'm going to give my vote to that because I'm going to benefit from that. Think about a rich person, for instance, and the society is discussing increasing taxes. So if you know your place in society, if you know you are a rich person, you will say, no, I'm not going to vote for that, because if I vote for increasing taxes, it's not because this is right or wrong, but because I might lose with that, so my vote will be no. At the same time, if you're a very poor person, and you can only benefit from that, and you know we'll have no costs in this tax increase, you will say, oh, sure, yeah, no, let's increase, and let's increase more of that. So now, if we know our places in society, it's very difficult to be impartial. And if we are not impartial, we are not just. So as simple as that. So Rawls thought that if we were under something that he called the veil of ignorance, we would be able not to know our places in society. And if we don't know our place in society, then we can talk in an impartial, unfair way about the things that should be done. Of course, because some people have more than others. For people who have few resources, somehow we would have to start by giving general means to these people to be equal and free. So he was recommending, advising that societies should distribute or redistribute, if you prefer, first what he called primary goods. They are general purpose goods that would allow people to be free and equal. So this is what the first slides are explaining. What happened first when Rawls wrote his theory of justice is that he was very against utilitarianism. And then later he considered, well, whatever, perhaps, well, we don't have to agree on everything. So perhaps if you want to be utilitarian, if I want to follow a rights-based approach, well, perhaps there are certain areas which might be private that you don't have to agree with everyone. So it's only for those areas in which we would have an overlapping consensus that are important. So things related not to religion, or things related to, well, even some of your preferences that are cultural, they would not be part of the overlapping consensus. Now, by doing so, Rawls was able to build the idea that we should look at the basic structure of society to see how societies can cooperate for mutual advantage. So that was quite a challenge, and there was a mechanism for redistribution there, because people would have to be free and equal to produce impartial and fair laws. So the question about distributing primary goods was essential. Of course, part of the difficulty is whether institutions are able or not to distribute that in a fair way. But if they do, the natural outcome would be Rawls' two principles of justice. Now, the first principle, there's not much to say, it's simply equal liberty. It's simply that each person would have an equal right to the most extensive system of basic liberties, which they would have to be compatible with a system of liberty for all. He was thinking in terms of positive and negative freedom, so you should have all these different good things for you, provided that you do not undermine the position of other people, otherwise that will not be coherent. Now, what is interesting is that he recognized, and that is part of the second principle, and the second part of the second principle, which is called the difference principle, that societies perhaps should allow a little bit of inequality. Why? Because inequality means that some people are earning more than others, and this earning more than others could be for justified reasons. We all know that not all forms of inequality are bad. Now, it's not because I'm slightly ill that I'm using this, this example. But inequality, some people have said that before, is like cholesterol. You have the good one and you have the bad one. So the good aspect of inequality is that inequality is about rewarding things that people have, so it's an incentive for things that people have, such as their main effort or even talents that they have and other people don't have. That's why John Romer thinks differently about the notion of opportunities, but that's a different discussion. Now, but we do have the negative aspect, the unfair side of inequality. That would be the bad cholesterol part of the story. Now, what Rawls considered is that societies can increase their level of inequality provided that they are able to compensate. It's the maximum principle. So you are maximizing people who are under the lowest position in society. So provided you are able to compensate somehow people who are living under these difficult conditions. Now, I think what he has in mind is something very simple. Let the rich get their money, but let them pay their taxes, and let's increase the provision of public goods so the poor are not going to be trapped in their poverty. So I think the message is quite clear. So we can see that with Rawls we have something different. We do not have that weak sustainability. Things are not fully commensurable. One cannot simply do the game of commensurability of utilitarianism, because some goods, they are more important than others. You have to respect, for instance, the principle of equal liberty. You cannot violate some rights that people have. So if you are in a position of violating those rights, one doesn't do certain things that one would do. Even if you have an economic gain, that economic gain will not be able to compensate. So the issue that Amartya Sen has called welfarism, which is the fact that all these utilities, like something without form, it's a real problem. Now let me explain this intuition to you. Now, have you ever prepared a cake? Well, I don't know, I'm not a good cook, but well, when you are preparing a cake, you need some flour, you need some eggs, what else? You need some milk, you need, if it's an orange cake, you might need orange. So you have all these things, and you can see orange and eggs and flour. So what utilitarianism does is that it combines everything. In such a way you cannot see the elements that were there before. You can only see by big or bigger pieces and small or smaller pieces of what you have. So welfarism is that everything has a common denominator, everything becomes part of the same thing, and it's just a quantitative question. Now what Rawls' perspective brings is a concern not simply with justice, but is with fairness and impartiality and the distribution of rights in society as a precondition for achieving all the forms of justice and fairness. Now finally, let's go into Aristotle. I mentioned to you that Aristotle might be one of the tricky cases here. Now, and in order to understand Aristotle, we should understand this idea of telos. Telos is an end. Telos is something which has a purpose. If we start with Aristotle's simple examples, that is very straightforward. You should ask, what's the telos of a flute? Oh, it's to produce music. The main idea of any instrument, musical instrument, is to produce music. There are other things, but what's the main thing? And what's the telos of a bird? A telos of a bird, well, is to fly, one would say. But what's the telos of a child? What's the main purpose of a child? Some people would say that's to become an adult. But what's the telos of an adult? And then we get into something difficult. Because for Aristotle would be the achievement or the fulfillment of certain potentials related to human nature. But that very much depends on the particular lives we have. So that's the first point in order to try to understand Aristotle. If this is the case, everything that contributes to that telos is not that important. So Aristotle introduced a definition here between means and ends. That's a very important definition to understand development ethics as phrased by or framed by Senna Nussbaum. Now, let me tell you a story. I don't know whether you have heard the story of this king called Midas. Yeah, Midas was a very rich king, and one day he did something good for the gods. And the gods asked Midas, "Well, we're very pleased with you, and you have one wish. What do you want?" Midas had what he thought was an excellent idea. "Let me do in such a way that whatever I touch becomes gold." Yeah? So think about my glass. Yeah? Not much used. Yeah? But, well, anyway, I would touch, Midas would touch, and that would become gold. Yeah? Brilliant. Yeah, he will become even richer. Yeah? And that happened. What he did not think is that by doing so, he would not be able to touch his food, and even his daughter. He was touching, well, I don't know, his daughter, and she was transformed into a gold statue. So, what are the real things that are important for us in life, and what are the things that are means for achieving that? Now, the main idea behind this tale is that things such as income, or simply gold, if you prefer, or wealth, if you prefer, they are means for people to achieve things that are important for them in life. So this division between means and ends, they are essential for thinking about the things that are important in life and things which are simply instruments in order to achieve the important things in life. Now that comes from the Comim ethics, from Aristotle, and the main point is that what matters is what people are really able to achieve. So we have to stop for Aristotle and talk about the nature of the good. Simple subjective preferences are not the main thing. The main thing is what are the meaning that people get from the things they do in life. So in order to be good, people have actually to live a good life. That's only by doing that they develop a character. So, and people with character are people that are able to fulfill all the potentials of a good life. Now, all this process was called by Aristotle of eudaimonia. Oh, it's such a funny name, isn't it? But this eudaimonia thing is not about living well. It's not simply about having a comfortable life. There's a certain urge to become which is behind that. People are becoming things, and people are becoming and exploring their full potentials. Now, well, you might thinking, what are the links between the different approaches here? Now, there's nothing like that in utilitarianism. And when it comes to the freedom perspective, there are some possibilities of overlap between the two approaches. But while one is not talking about someone becoming and fulfilling a potential, you would need these two things to come together. Now, these things come together, for instance, in Sandel's work, a little bit in Amartya Sen's work, a little bit more in Martha Nussbaum's work. So I put a quotation for you. Let me read that quotation for you. So Sandel has said, the purpose of politics is nothing less than to enable people to develop their distinctive human capacities and virtues, to deliberate about the common good, to acquire practical judgment, to share in self-government, to care for the fate of the community as a whole. So within this perspective, the whole issue of sustainability would be to allow people to develop these human capacities, these human virtues, and that we would all together would be able to talk about the common good. So we can see that this capacity for judgment is what institutions will need as well. So that's how the Aristotelian framework would see the issue of sustainability. But it's extremely important to emphasize that for Aristotle, morality and ethics is not simply about what people say, it's about what people do. So ultimately, habits are fundamental because our moral virtues, they are formed by habits. And the telos is not the purpose of things that people have in life, is not something static, but something that people can talk about, people can reason about the telos, and that would link well with very brief mentions to two approaches that I want to include here before I finish. Now the first one is Amartya Sen's capability approach, and the second one, which is very similar, is Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. When we talk about theories of justice, let me repeat, we have utilitarianism, maximizing the consequences of utility. They are all commensurable, so welfareism is there, and we assess with some ranking, putting all of them together. That's one thing, Then we have the rights or the freedom approach, and there are so many different writers, but Rawls is one of the most influential. It's about being impartial, it's about people being equal and free, and it's about considering together through public reason and overlapping consensus what are the best things to do. And then we have Aristotle, and this Aristotelian approach. Some people say, oh, but aren't these thoughts about the common good, communitarian, that people only think about communities and they will not think enough about the individual? So there is a lot of discussion about that, but ultimately it's about allowing people to exercise their potentials, and they need to exercise that. They need habits, they need practice, and in such a way that by exercising virtues we would be promoting the common good. And these are very quick stylized facts about these three different approaches. As you know, there are people who would sit a term or perhaps a full academic year only to study Kant or Aristotle or, utilitarianism. But it's just for us to be able to situate. And then we come to the capability approach. When we come to the capability approach, what Sen is saying, basically, is that there are many ways in which we can assess whether things are just or not. There are many informational spaces, and there is no reason for us to isolate our assessment only to utilities or only to one particular form of rights or not even to resources. What Sen is arguing is that all these different informational spaces taken into consideration might produce distortions. So he advocates for informational pluralism. Whenever we are in a situation to assess whether something is good or bad, let's consider as many different kinds of information as we can. So let's use resources and subjective views and rights and capabilities. Now, capabilities are sets of functionings, and functionings are things that people are able to be and able to do. Now, the traditional example is the example of a bicycle. But I don't have bicycles here. So let's see what I have here. I have here, for instance, books. And I have, let me get one book that I like. Nussbaum's Creating Capabilities. What's a book? A book is a resource. So you might get a resource, and the question is, are you going to convert this resource into something? The fact that you have a resource is a necessary, but is not a sufficient condition. So what Sen and Nussbaum are saying is that resources are imperfect indicators of well-being. You can assess the well-being of people only by checking the resources they have. But I can have this resource, and this resource, if I don't open the book and if I don't read the book, it doesn't mean much. So the main issue here is if I read. And if I read, I'll be able to know certain things. This will be able to know things I'm able to be, I'm able to do. When I put them together, they are functions. And sets of functions, they represent capabilities. Why capabilities are so important? Because they represent the level of freedom that people have. So by doing so, they are able to combine a little bit between the Aristotelian approach, Nussbaum in particular coming as being before an Aristotelian philosopher, an Aristotelian approach, and at the same time a sort of Kantian approach, an approach coming from John Rawls. We could also say that we have subjective information about the book. You get the book and you say, oh, this is awful, I don't like this book. So from 1 to 10, how happy you are that you have to read this book? Well, 2, you might answer. But then I might open the book. And then I open the book and I say, oh, this is really good. I was so wrong. This book is really nice. So your subjective information might be wrong. And that is the case of the fox and the sour grapes. Yeah, we do not have an objective information. It might be distorted by many other kinds of things. Yeah. If you don't believe in what I'm saying, you might wish to read Thinking Fast and Slow, is the name of a book by Kahneman, and it's very interesting because he talks about how different heuristics allow us to do things that somehow they will not be the first things we would do. But my example here is just to define what are capabilities, which are these sets of functionings that they are vectors, they are lists, or things that people are able to be unable to do. Now, what Sen is saying is that, well, we should not be discussing about particular lists and sets of capabilities. And that's why he chooses to talk about the capability approach. So the capability approach is about judgment, is about deliberation, is about capacity that individuals and then societies, the concept of public reason is central here, are able to deliberate about the best thing. In our example, in our concern about sustainability, sustainability should be able to represent this public reason. So Rawls would talk about overlapping consensus. So the conditions for the overlapping consensus are not there. That's the main reason why we cannot get at sustainability. But Nussbaum would say something different. Nussbaum would say, well, in order to say that we are actually achieving something which are basic capabilities, are important capabilities, we do need a normative anchor. We do need to talk about particular capabilities that are essential to define what's a human being, what would give dignity to a human being. That's why we talk about the capabilities approach when we are using Nussbaum's framework, and that's why we talk about the capability approach when we are talking about Sen. But there is one important thing to clarify, because the notion of capability, or the word capability, it's a combination between capacity and ability. And ability for Sen represents the autonomy that people have to exercise or to carry out their choices. So it's not simply about things that people are able to be and to do. It's about valuable things. It's about choice. It's about agency. It's about things that are important to people. In this sense, sustainability should be about things that have been discussed and things that have value for people. Now, I have put some quotations there for the capability and the capabilities approach in our PowerPoint, and I have also called their attention that in Nussbaum's work in 2006, when she writes The Frontiers of Justice, she introduced the notion of justice for non-human animals, which expands a lot the way in which we can use the capability approach for talking about different treatments that we give to animals different moralities that we might be representing or no. So this means that we might consider animals as means or as ends, and her argument is that we should consider animals as ends in themselves the same way that we treat human beings. So it's closer to stronger forms of sustainability, and she's distancing herself from more economic forms, more utilitarian forms as well. Now, this is our 50 minutes. I understand that's the time. Hopefully the whole idea is clear to you. If it's not, if you think that parts of it are unclear, please do write to me. I can complement. The difficulty I have at the moment is that I cannot travel. But that's the only difficulty. And the other things are more or less, but it's okay. But I'm glad to explain further any points that you might consider useful. So I'm sending these slides to you, the PowerPoints to you. I'm sending these 2 classes to you. And hopefully everything is going to be fine. Once again, apologies for any inconveniences that this might cause. I think it's much nicer, it's much easier to go to class than actually watching a video. Sorry if the video was very boring as well. I tried to explain things as clear as I could. Now hopefully you'll have an opportunity to see you in person, but before that I will record another 2 classes. Okay, see you. Bye bye.